Okay, as I kind of view all of these lessons that we've been looking at, growing our faith so that we can, for the purpose of sharing our faith, in many ways, this is possibly the most difficult. We know basically to a certain degree what the content is that we want to share with others, although each and every one of us can learn more about that. There's never an element or a point in time in which we say we know everything. As I say here in our little introductory paragraph, we know that we are utterly and totally, completely unique. We know that our students, whether it's one singular student or two or three, there is absolutely no student exactly like the ones that are in front of us. And so the question then becomes, how can we combine these unique stories and share the gospel? So I have some points here. These are things that I have stressed or perhaps maybe had stressed to me throughout my ministry. Things that I believe are important, and I would encourage you to share any observations or thoughts or questions that you might have as we go through this. I think obviously the very most important is we need to remember what our goal is. And that is Matthew. Can anybody quote Matthew 28, 18 through 20? Maybe not word for word, but get the gist of it.
Matthew, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel.
Almost.
Baptizing them and
Almost.
teaching them to observe all things, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There's more to it.
Yeah, you misquoted the command.
Yeah, well, I should know it because it's on my daddy's tombstone.
Yeah. Go into all the world and make disciples.
Okay.
Make disciples. Baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teaching them to observe everything that I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. Because that sentence begins in our English text with a command. I can't remember the English word for command. Go ye therefore into all the world. We tend to think that is the command. In English, it sounds like that is the command. In Greek, the form of the sentence is make disciples. That's the command. Going, baptizing, and teaching are the three participles that explain how we are to go about making disciples. It's almost, we could word it correctly in English, but it would, to go back to my favorite word, it would just sound wonky. It would just sound, that's basically how we would have to say it. Make disciples. Going. Baptizing. Teaching. But that just doesn't work in our English sentence. It doesn't flow well. It just doesn't sound right. So in English, go, therefore, make disciples. The thing is with Greek, participles typically take the force of the main verb. The main verb is and I sure wish I could think of that word. Uh, Imperative, thank you. I knew it started with an I, I just couldn't come up with it. The main verb, make disciples, is the imperative. Now, so those three participles then take up the flavor of the imperative. Um, and so, how are you supposed to make disciples? Well, you go, you baptize, and you teach. They all three of those participles pick up that imperatival influence or power. So baptism is absolutely essential, and I don't ever want to suggest that baptism is not essential, but baptism is not the goal. And at the risk of really sounding heretical, I think that's the problem of several of our major evangelistic, you know, evangelism in a box kind of programs, is they bring the student up to the point of baptism, and then the question is, well, what do you do after your baptism? After you're baptized? Well, be a good person. Go to church. You'll figure it out. Or if you go to church, your preacher will tell you. Or if you go to church and you go to Bible class, the Bible class teacher will explain it to you. Well, those are all good, and they're all necessary, and they're all important. But if we bear in mind that we are to make disciples, then being a part of the church family flows under that. Attending Bible classes to the very best of your ability and time and necessities and everything else flows under that. Worshiping on a weekly basis flows under that. It's all part and parcel of becoming a disciple. The other thing is, if our goal is to make a disciple, then we communicate that to our student throughout our study that I'm not going to let you go. Very, 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 very good, efficient, successful evangelists that I have been associated with do a very good job of roping people and bringing them in the church. And then, because they're so good at what they do, they're off to their next student. And it's almost like, okay, I got him here. Now it's your job. And a disciple, a relationship, it's almost like, okay, I bring you into the church. I'm not going to let you go. And so I'm going to stay with you and work with you and continue to help you grow and help you learn, which slows us, if you want to think of it this way, kind of slows us down. We're not off to the next target. We're not off to the next victim. We have a group of individuals. And the other thing is that as we disciple that individual, we are helping them to step out and disciple others. And so we have children, and we have grandchildren, or we have disciples, and we have grand disciples, and we have great grand disciples, and we have great great grand disciples, because they are discipling others as we disciple them. Dennis.
You know, it's something that backs up what you're getting at here is Paul's advice to Timothy in 1 Timothy 1:5. It says, "But the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith." That we trust God that if we do these things in this way, the results that He wants, that's the way to get the results that He wants.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Any other? Yeah. Brad?
One of the, the logistics of what you're saying is just not disputable as far as evangelists that are really good. But one of the things that I have seen works best is once they have been brought to Christ, instead of saying, I will not let you go, we should be saying, we will not let you
Yes.
go. Because the next step would be a class with a title that now I'm a new Christian. And that's where it picks up in the church. And suddenly you go from a person to a couple or three people. And again, you're building that, multi-layer organization that will help that person find their way. But that's where you make the transition is a logical transition is after baptism. And
Yeah.
the problem with that is, whose job is that? Well, it's not good old Mr. Nobody. Somebody in the church need to take on that responsibility. And
Yeah.
somebody after that person takes on the goal then of, how would you like to serve?
Yes.
Where do you see yourself fitting in the things that this church is doing? And so it's a logical progression, but the first step is to stop saying I and to start saying we.
We. For those of you on our audio or even the visual that may not have picked up Brad's comment, the idea that we shift from I being your discipler to we and us and our being your disciplers. And actually a part of discipling, even prior to baptism, if it's going to be more of a lengthy Bible study, which in my mind it should be, but we have already introduced them into the church family, and we have already made them aware that, okay, this is your church family. When you become a disciple, you become a part of us. But absolutely, Brad's comment that the I teaching you, I discipling you becomes we disciple you. And a comment that Dennis made last week or a couple of weeks ago, Dennis, I'm not exactly sure when it was, but and Brad just echoed it this morning, is that especially over the last few decades, church growth scholars, the gurus of church growth, have discovered that if you want a person to stay in the church, you give them a job. You say, okay, you've made the commitment to Jesus Christ. You want to be a disciple of Christ. How can you help us? You are a part of us. Now, how can we help you fit into this church family? Which we're going to talk about next week, building a nursery for new babies. But this idea of incorporation, and it can actually occur before the person makes the commitment. One congregation in particular in Abilene, back when I was one of my student years, they would immediately, as they were working with somebody, they would try to plug them into a Bible class, right? And as a part of that Bible class, they were given an assignment. You're in charge of the coffee pot. Go get the coffee pot. Well, where is it? Well, it's in the fellowship room. Well, where is it? Well, here, let me show you. And so that person became the keeper of the coffee pot. Or another person would write down prayer requests, or another person would, and so they were immediately made to feel like, hey, I'm respected here. I'm not just a target. And so that is is a part of the us discipling you, the we discipling you, as opposed to just one person.
It's one of the reasons small groups end up being so powerful,
Yes.
is because it isn't high church, but it is. And it just doesn't look like it. And they get to have a personal relationship in a small group with each and every person. And the conversations are not only spiritually oriented, but other oriented too, where
Yeah.
suddenly they can feel, hey, this is something I would like to belong to. And things like that.
Well, if we use the words like family, father, brother and sister, then we need to exemplify that. It's very, very easy for those of us who have been a part of the congregation for years and years and years to have that sense of camaraderie, that sense of family, and to welcome others. I think of our newest children, newest babes, Kelsey, Doyle. Yeah, I was. I remembered his name yesterday. And to help them feel like, okay, I am really a part of this. And that's where Doyle and Wendy have been such an incredible encouragement to me, because they have been so faithful since Doyle's conversion. It's just been awesome. All right, moving right along. As Fozzie the Bear once famously said, number 2, we need to remember who the ultimate teacher is. And there are a couple of passages here that I wanted to highlight. If somebody could turn to Luke 24, I'll read Acts 16. But Paul is, he's in Philippi. And he goes out to this riverside where apparently there is no synagogue in Philippi, which is kind of, in and of itself, kind of interesting. But they assume that there is a place of prayer. There's a group of people going out, and so he assumes that that's going to be a place of prayer where the Jews can meet. And there was a group of women there, and one of the ladies that had gathered there was a woman named Lydia. She was a worshiper of God. I don't know if that means that she was a proselyte, whether she was a full-blood Jew, but she's worshiping God. And the Lord opens her heart to pay attention to what Paul was saying. And so to get the cart behind the horse, Paul was a teacher, as we have a passage that we have referenced several times. Paul, in talking to the Corinthians, said, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. And so the Lord opens Lydia's heart to hear what Paul is teaching. Now, Luke, 24 or 45? Somebody could read Luke 24, 45.
Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures.
Yeah, this is following the resurrection, and he has spent, and scholars debate this, anywhere from at least a year to up to 3 years teaching them about the scriptures, and he still has to open their mind to understand the scriptures. So God, the Holy Spirit, are going to be the ultimate teachers. And this, for anyone who has taught, I know Dennis has experienced this, Brad has probably experienced this. Susan was a substitute teacher. I don't know if Dee has ever experienced formal education, that sort of thing. But it is astounding to me how our students grasp things that we didn't think we were teaching. And it's like, oh, I must be a pretty good teacher for you to learn that. And we're like, we go home and we go, how did they get that? Whoa. Because education is just such an astounding thing. And that's, I love teaching. I love the concept of education. It has just been a fascinating thing to me how human beings learn and how our students can learn far more than what we teach. There's a little saying that I really, really, really like, and that is that you cannot go where God has not already been. God's going to get there first. And so if you're teaching a student about the gospel, if you're teaching a student about Jesus, God's already been there, and he's leading the way. Number 3, if Scripture is our authority, then let's stay with the text. In context, this is where my little burr under my saddle. I know that individuals will argue that when they put together their evangelistic programs, they make sure that if they take a text from Romans or 1 Thessalonians or 2 Thessalonians or wherever it is, that they are taking that text and they are reading it in context. And I've heard that defended umpteen times. The problem is the student doesn't see the context. The student is only seeing that you're pulling out one verse or 2 verses or 3 verses. They don't have, unless I take this Dennis's group, an individual who has been a part of the Baptist church or Methodist church or whatever for many, many, many years, and they're familiar with a particular book of the Bible, and they understand, and they can read that verse, and they say, oh yeah, Dennis is certainly reading this verse in context. The vast majority of our students are not going to have that kind of biblical background. And they're not going to be able to see that we're taking that text in context. And so all they hear is a number first, a very, very, very strange word, Thessalonians. They have absolutely no idea what Thessalonians means. And a couple of other verses, a couple of other numbers. 2:12, 3:13, 5:6. It doesn't mean anything to them. And so, once upon a time, we were more biblically literate as a culture. We are profoundly biblically illiterate these days. And so, unless you want to sit down and go through the entire background of the church in Thessalonica and where Paul established, where Thessalonica is and when Paul established the church in Thessalonica and all of that, which would turn a 1-hour Bible study into a 6-month study. Let's stay in context. The thing that I like about this is you don't have to be certified. You don't have to pass any tests. You don't have to be qualified to teach any kind of method or program. All you need is this. And any kind of translation that you like. And we all have our favorite translations. Some perhaps may be better for individual studies. Some perhaps not so good. But that's up to you. That's your choice. And I would suggest that we stay with one gospel. whatever student that we have, stay with one gospel. And in doing so, we're actually teaching two concepts. Number one, we're talking about the life of Jesus and what it means for that gospel writer, his concept of discipleship. But then we're also saying this is important, that staying in context is important. Another issue I have with these, following the bouncing scripture kind of programs is that that's how we get somebody to the point of baptism, and then after they become a Christian, we say, don't do that. Stay in context. Don't pick 15 different verses, just hither, thither, and yon. Well, that's how you taught me to become a Christian. And automatically it throws a fog of confusion. Well, if you did that to teach me how to become a Christian, why don't we do that all the time? Well, because we need to stay in context. Well, then let's stay in context all the time. So we're undergirding our teaching by what we're teaching. Anything, questions, thoughts, comments about points number 2 or 3? I didn't ask about point number 2. Anybody have a point about who the ultimate teacher is, or staying with the text? All right, point number 4. Let's choose a gospel story that best fits your student. Now this, you might say, then that means I have to be a specialist in all 4 gospels. Not necessarily, because you are also unique. And there may be a gospel that you really, really, really like to teach from, and if you're really, really, really zoned into a particular gospel, then you need to stay with that gospel. However, if you're familiar enough with all 4 gospels, based then on your student, there may be a particular gospel that fits them better. Matthew is very, very highly structured. And I would say that Mark, Luke, and John are also structured, but not to the extent, not to the degree that Matthew is structured. Matthew is very, very structured according to the Old Testament. He has 5 sections of teaching. He has 5 sections of journeys or narrative, corresponding to the 5 books of the Pentateuch. He uses Old Testament texts in prophecy that Jews would be very, very familiar to. If somebody likes real structure, they're tied more. The phrase that I came up with: if you're studying with a student that you kind of identify as being really old school, Matthew might be the best gospel for them. I love Matthew. I genuinely, even though I probably did more study out of the Gospel of John, I just really like Matthew. Mark is structured, but structured differently. Mark really has an appeal to those who are searchers, who are willing to ask questions. And one of the things I just picked up on not that long ago is how many times Mark talks about people being afraid. Something happens and they were afraid. And something happens and they were afraid. And it, depending on your concept of when the Gospel of Mark ends, many scholars believe that the last phrase in the Gospel of Mark is, and they were afraid. I don't think so. But it's fascinating that even at the closing words of Mark, he does not shy away from the fact that saying, disciples can fear. Just because you're a disciple doesn't mean that you have all the answers, that you have your life put together. There are doubts and there are fears. Mark is really a wonderful, it moves very, very quickly. Matthew's 28 chapters, Luke's 24 chapters, John is what, 22? I don't remember these things. 21, I'm sorry. John is 21, Mark is 16. So a third less lengthy, a third shorter, I guess. It moves very, very quickly. One of Mark's favorite words is immediately. And immediately, and immediately, and immediately. So it moves. Mark doesn't shy away from things that Matthew considers to be far too delicate. If Jesus is going to spit on the ground and make mud, you're going to read about it in Mark. You're not going to read about it in Matthew. That's just too, It's too unsanitary. It's too unhygienic for a good Jew like Matthew. Mark's like, he spat on the ground and made mud and rubbed it on somebody's eyes, or he spat on somebody's tongue. Matthew's like, too much information. If you're talking to somebody who has a shorter attention span, you can get through Mark a whole lot quicker than you can Matthew or Luke or John. Luke is fascinating because it is structured as a journey. Do you know a person in your life who always uses words like journey? Life is a journey. We're all on a path. I'm looking forward to what's in front of me. Using words connected to journey and path and discovery. Luke is kind of structured that way. The other thing about Luke, if your student is really connected to human emotions and human feelings, and Luke was the physician. Paul tells us that Luke was the great physician, or Luke, not the great physician, he is the physician, Luke. And so Luke shares a lot of interpersonal type relationships that Jesus had that maybe Matthew and Luke, and Matthew and Mark and John don't. Luke tells us about the story of the rich young ruler. I think maybe Matthew also has the rich young ruler. But if a person is going to be named, chances are that story is going to be in Luke. Not always, but Luke adds these little details that your student might find to be interesting or might connect. John, especially the early sections up through chapter 9, which is one conversation, one relationship after another. And so John focuses a lot on conversations. He focuses a lot on relationships. And so the back half of John is this relationship that Jesus has with God and how Jesus draws his disciples into that relationship with God. God, that beautiful prayer, what we call the high priestly prayer, is in John, not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And so Jesus draws the disciples, Father, may they be one with you as I am one with you. And so the early part of John is Jesus creating this circle of disciples, drawing them to him. And then the back half of John is Jesus drawing these disciples up to God and taking them up to God. Beautiful expression of how we move people to perhaps maybe a relationship with us, but our goal is to take them up to God. Now, the thing that I want to stress about this is we don't have to be a specialist in these Gospels. All we need to do is to be able to sit down and read the Gospels with our student. And we can actually do this in more than one way. we can give them a homework assignment. Okay, for our first Bible study, what I would really like for you to do is read, pick a gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and read the first chapter. And when we gather together, we'll talk about that first chapter. And so you may not even know which gospel they're going to pick. Hopefully they're not going to pick Matthew, because Matthew chapter 1 is just a whole bunch of unpronounceable names. So maybe now if you choose Matthew, let's look at Matthew 1 and 2. But anyway, you don't have to be a specialist to sit down and to read a chapter a day or per Bible study, or you might not even get through an entire chapter. Some of the chapters in Matthew are 50 verses long. Luke has some monstrously long chapters, so you might not be able to get all the way through. Okay, very, very quickly as we get ready to transition into our worship service. These 6 points I have distilled these 6 points through my time, my study with others. Our emphasis on sharing our faith is going to be focused on Jesus. We don't want to focus on me. We don't want to focus on the church. We don't want to focus on weird questions that arise from time to time on the Bible. It is sensitive to the student. If the student has a question, take that question seriously. You may not be able to answer it, but you can write it down and you can say, listen, let me study for a week on this. And let's come back to this next week and hopefully I'll have an answer for you. Completely based on the gospel story, I would suggest following one gospel all the way through, although using the others as you feel like it's necessary and beneficial. Just think, in the first century, did they have all four? Did every Christian have all 4 gospels in front of them? They may have only had Matthew. They may have only had John. So we obviously have all 4, and so we can use all 4 if we need to. It lifts the burden off of us to be the evangelist. God is the evangelist. The Holy Spirit is the evangelist. And so we don't have to carry that burden. And then lastly, as we started, it keeps the focus on making disciples. We certainly want to stress baptism. Baptism is absolutely essential. We want to stress being a part of the church, the family, but that when we become a Christian, the Lord adds us to the church. We are making disciples. As we conclude this lesson, any other questions, thoughts, comments that anyone might have about this particular topic? Next week, I don't want to say that next week is the absolute end, because there may be a question arise to go beyond next week. Next week, we're going to talk about making a nursery for new Christians. And we're going to talk about some of the issues related to and involved with a program of evangelism. Why some congregations handle it very, very, very well, and why some congregations it's almost impossible to have a program of any kind of evangelism. So that's where we're headed next week. All right, Sharon and Josie are here, so we can get ready for our worship service this morning. Let's all take a break and get ready for our worship service.